Hello, today I'm going to show you how to paint a bigger picture. I've mixed up a cool blue just as a foil because the turquoise water is going to be the focal point. So I want a neutral sky as a foil. I've mixed turquoise and French ultramarine with a little bit of Azilian crimson. I'm going carefully round the lighthouse. Nobody's ever lived on Round Island apart from the lighthouse keepers because it's quite a sheer rock. The next thing to put in, as it's a long way away, is the beach. Islands can tend to grow when you're painting them, so if I put in the beach, I've set my barriers. There's very white sand on the Isles of Scilly, so I'm going to use Naples yellow. There's dunes that go down to the sand as well, but it's very, very white sand, and Naples yellow is a good way of putting it in. Just not too strong, just to claim the space. And that will stop me getting tempted to bring the island out further. And there's also some sand that I can see on the next little island here. I'll put a list of these islands on the description and the paints I'm using. I went for a day trip and hired a bicycle to cycle around St.Mary. I've actually got 3 islands here, so I'm just going to put in the rock of Round Island with homemade grey. There's hardly any of it showing, just the right hand side, so I'll do the brush strokes going down from top to bottom at a slight angle, and then some of it's visible through the trees. And then just to separate it, I'm going to use some raw umber and just put little downward strokes in to make it look like the shape of rock. And moving forward, I've got a hint of another island here, just a little bit round the trees, and that's nearer, so it's lighter. So homemade grey, I'm going to put strokes of Naples yellow in, and that'll find its own way. Now the next thing to do is to put in some grass. I'm going to start with sap green and add a little bit of French ultramarine. I'm putting them in gently to start with, and then I'll go in a bit heavier. I'm going to add strips of grass. So I've got roads here and little tracks and fields. I just want to separate one from another. There was a little fields that made me want to paint it. They're obviously out of the wind and they're protected by hedges, and it all looks very interesting. They would be used for growing flowers mostly, perhaps some potatoes. But just interesting facet into island life. Just feather it down a bit, but that's claimed some of the space. Now I want to put the very dark trees in, so I need to mix up a really dark colour because they're at such a distance. The only way I'm going to get them in is to just one brush stroke. So I'm mixing chrome yellow and indigo, which should make it quite a dark green. And I'm just going to add a little bit of bright red just to warm it up a fraction. Just try it there. That looks dark enough. Now I'm going to change to a number 2 brush. That was a number 4. And just follow the line of the trees from the top down. Because it's so far away, there's no detail, it's just shape. A little bit of water. Just let it down a little bit. You can always tint it again. And then there's a little gap, more trees, black. It could have been a little bit darker. I'll drop some wet paint in. And these follow the line of the island. See, these trees are protected by Round Island. Over here there's nothing growing because it's in the full force of the wind. I've got a pointy one there, so I'm going to stick that one in as a reference and work back. If you find anything that's obvious, it's always better to stick it in. Then you can decide whether it's a good or bad thing. Do you want to put every detail in, or do you want to miss some out? Going across. Very important to have wiggly tops on the trees. And while this is wet, I will drop some of the same paint in, and it'll just make some more detail. Just bringing the tree line down a bit. I'll just drop a little bit of stronger mix in. Because every now and again there is a little bit of shadow. Just makes it look more interesting. So that's those done. Now there's a gap and there's some individual trees. So I'll put the tree line in the best I can. And these are going not so well. I think they haven't got so much protection. So they're not so much foliage. Can always add a little bit to them later, but I don't want to overdo it. The Isles of Scilly is one of the places that you can still see elm trees. They didn't get wiped out with the mainland English ones. So that's got to dry. While that's drying, I'm going to put some rocks in. So I'm going to use a homemade grey and a warm brown. So I've got burnt umber and raw umber here, and the homemade grey, and just drop some rocks in. And I've got some here that are just on the waterline. If it's a wet rock, it'd be much darker than a dry rock. So I'm just going to take them down. And there's some on the bend here. And just drop in some Paynes grey. Just a little bit, just for dark nooks and crannies. Not doing it all over, just occasional dots. Then up the top, these haven't got wet for a while, slightly more, or it could be sort of brown grass. It's a job to say, so I use very watery paint. So when you're at a distance, you have to sort of suggest. I can suggest a little bit more at the bottom of this rock. And then it's very dark for where the next island almost meets. I think it does meet, it's a job to say. That's because it's wet more often. And then a little bit of homemade grey on top, just for the bits that are dry. Now I can put in some dune grass. Now I'm going to use sap green mixed with Naples yellow, which makes it recess just distinguishes it. That seems to start all the way here with the rocks. Just go along. It's only a suggestion, so you don't need ultimate detail. Now, the reason I was keen to put the lighthouse in and the pointy tree was that I can map the hedges for the tree and the fields off. And it was the little fields that made me want to paint it. I need it quite dark. There's a hedge going along there. And then a much bigger hedge on the edge of the field with a lighter top. So I'm going to use lemon yellow for the lighter top. And then it's in shadow at the end. So I can use some of the indigo to put the shadow in. And I've got the semblance of an island. Now I've got some bushy trees and things here. So I need to just go back to a slightly bigger brush. Just make suggestions of them. And then I can add to detail later on. But there's not too much detail because it's so far away. It's more just a colour change. So going in with Naples yellow over the green here, just to give a different colour to the trees. And then some of them are in shadow, so I can add some dark to the front. These look like they're filling in another field barrier. Well, there's a crop behind here. Now there's an island hiding between these two, St. Helens. It's just a corner of St. Helens Island. So that seems to be slightly greener. So I can put that in a little bit. And then it reverts to some rocks. So let's just stick the green in first. We're using a different green. It's quite bright green in some places. And then just using the homemade grey to pull it back a little bit. It doesn't matter if the colours merge. And then some brighter green coming through the bottom of the trees here. It's difficult to say which island that belongs to. So you just have to keep going along and finding things. So that's drying now, so I can move over to this island, which hasn't managed to get a tree at all. It's got a very dark outline. Obviously there's something growing on one side but not the other. So I'm going to go in with a slightly smaller brush and just put the outlines in. So you can't show any detail really, so all I can do is a colour change. So I'm using a little bit of indigo and green and Paynes grey, and then I'm going to put bright green on the other side, which I'm going to use a little bit of chrome yellow and some sap green, and just use a little bit of each. And again, it doesn't matter if the colours run into each other. I'll just give them a loose edge. And then I've got some more islands here I bet they haven't got green on in winter. The storms will knock it off, but they've got something now. And then the one in the background's even more green, so I'm just going to change my brush load, put that on, and then use just water to move it around. And a little bit of Naples yellow just to push it back a little bit. So it helps show the distance. And I've got some rocks I can put in when it's dry. And these rocks aren't quite dark enough, and the hills, so I'm just going to add, I've got to put the rocks in next to them, so I'm going to make them a little bit darker with some French ultramarine. And it'll help the rocks show up. Wipe the brush off, just move the paint that I've just put there. So while they're drying, I'll do this little island here, which is mostly brown because it's nearer. So I'll start with some darker brown on the waterline and add a little bit of Paynes grey to it. Another one going out behind it. And then add some homemade grey just to give a change, which I'll drop some Naples yellow in. Just to send it back a bit. These rocks are almost overlapping from the angle I was painting from. By putting the yellow on, it's just sent the colours back. So I could now do the same treatment to a rock here. Start dark, add Paynes grey for the nooks and crannies, going the other way with the brush, and then adding Naples yellow on top. If you haven't got Naples yellow, you could just use very weak yellow ochre. I'm just going to take a little bit off that with the side of the brush. And then homemade grey for the pile of rocks here. And again, I'll drop some earth colour in just to give it a separation point. So just to show you that it works as well, if you haven't got Naples yellow, I'll drop in yellow ochre. Just send it back in highlights. And some very, very dark rocks behind it. So I'll pop those in. And they go all the way past that one. Now I've got a bit more beach to put in, so I'm going to use Naples yellow again because it's the best colour I've got. There's nearly sand colour. And I need to make the other end of the beach look the same. I'm just adding a little bit of more grass that's going up to the trees where there's more hedges that are semi-hidden for the crops. So I'm just going to add a little bit more yellow to differentiate the field from the hedge. And there's also some in here hidden. It's almost out of view, and a few more trees that are semi-hidden. So I need a different colour to put the different lot of trees in. So I'll just mix a different green, just mixing up blues and yellows, and just try and put them in, letting it bleed down from the trunk into the fields. That seems to have sorted it out. And then while I'm here, just a little bit of Paynes grey into the green, just to put a few swizzles on the trees behind so that they show up as slightly different. Now I can do the very dark hedge. So I'm going to mix up indigo and chrome yellow together and a little bit of red just to give it some warmth, and with a number 2 brush just do a straight line. And there's another little bit of hedge there, and then a darker end to this big hedge. So I now dry the brush off and go back with some yellow because this one's catching the sunshine, and then a 3rd green for the side. Just let that down a little bit, and I've got enough suggestion of some market gardening there. Is to add the sea, and what I'm going to do is use a flat brush. I've got a pack of flat brushes here because it's very important on such a big area to get good lines. So I'm just going to clean the palette off a little bit, and the sea around Scilly is very turquoise because there's no muddy rivers flowing into it. So I'm going to start with French ultramarine, which I'm going to warm up a little bit with Viridian and put that on as a base coat, and then when it's dry add other colours to it. So I've got the flat brush, which works quite well, just going in gently because it's going to have a second coat. Make it a little bit stronger. Some areas are got a wind pattern on and others haven't. Just keep reloading the brush every now and again, but keeping the same aspect. There's some rocks that I can add in a moment. Then changing the colour again. When you're doing big areas like this, it's nice to keep mixing the colour slightly. You don't want it to all be exactly the same. There's no waves through here on the day that I visited, so I just want it to be different colours of sea more than anything else. Just keep going, mix up a little bit more again, add a tiny bit of water. If you add too much you'll get it going off in a different direction, so just fairly dry brush, fill the page a little bit stronger. And then in the middle of the rocks, it's a different colour entirely, probably because it's more shallow and sheltered, so I'm just going in with some turquoise. Just going round the rocks gently. And then out to sea, it's slightly more green. Go gently up to the horizon. And then when this is dry, which will take probably 5 minutes, I can add some highlights. But it's picked out quite a lot already. I want to go over the sky again, just to make the white lighthouse show a little bit more. So I'm just mixing some French ultramarine and some turquoise and a little bit of Brazilian crimson again, just to get a slightly different mix to the first time. And I've turned the picture upside down, which is a very good way of getting a skyline. You're working at a better angle to get the exact line. I'm using a number 8 round brush on this occasion because I only really want the sky to be dark at the bottom to show the lighthouse. I don't want the whole picture to change its tonal values. And I can go round the lighthouse very nicely using this angle and the buildings that are there. And then through the trees, just gently. Now I'll get some water, just pull the paint back a bit. Leaving it dark around the lighthouse to show the white lighthouse. Just fill in any gaps, because this sky is a foil for the rest of the picture. Just make sure there's no areas that are inappropriate. And turn it back up the right way. You can see the lighthouse is showing a lot more now. So that's got to dry before I do anything. Just see, now it's the right way up, I can see a couple of little bits that need attention. I'm now going to return to the sea and put in a slightly brighter colour, and it'll leave a pattern because there's some white paper showing. I've just mixed turquoise and French ultramarine together. I'm just going along the beach line. I'm going all the way to the edge of the paper. This time I'll start from this side, work back. Haven't quite got enough paint on there. Very large piece of paper this. I might have to change to a smaller brush. It's a good quality brush, so it's got quite a good point. What you have to do is tilt it and hold it nearer the ferrule if you're going in for very detailed areas. Sometimes you just have to swap brushes halfway through a task to make sure that you're in control. Just mixing up some more paint. If you keep mixing it up, you get good variety. It's slightly brighter because it's the water that's nearest. Try and cover up as many of the little white pieces as I can, because I want the white lighthouse to be the lightest part of the painting. Now I'm going to change to a number 4 and go for the water that's further out, which I'm going to make more turquoise. Just going round the nooks and crannies very gently. If I've lipped it onto the sand, I can just take it off with my finger. Oh, my finger's put more on there, but I can sort it out. And again, hold the brush nearer the ferrule and tip it up to a different angle for the tricky bits. It always takes 2 or 3 goes to get it round all the rocks. You think you've got them all, and then you find an area that's not quite right. It doesn't matter if it doesn't quite reach the horizon, because there's often a different colour on the horizon. Now I did get some with my finger back on again, so I'm going to use a smaller flat brush. Just gently lift it off. Now that's got to dry for a minute or 2. So the next thing I can do is just look at the different colours and see where that there's lots of dark lines across here because there's some rocks, but I'm not ready to put those in yet. And in the middle it's quite turquoise, so just get the turquoise colour and just drop it in there while it's still a bit damp. It's like almost a sheltered pool there with much shallower water. But it's a good focal point to have a warm colour in the middle or a lighter colour. Now the lighthouse and the lightkeeper's cottages, there's a few shadows on there, so I'm going to get a number 1 brush and some homemade grey tinted with a bit of Paynes grey, and there's 4 cottages or 4 buildings, and they're all a little bit dark to one side, so I'm just going to go with 1 stroke, 4, and then there's another one. Just going to lift that off a little. It will dry a bit lighter, but I want to be in control. That there's a light, not quite at the top, but a little way down. And that's got a different colour. So that's about all I need for the distance. But there's some more rocks I can put in on the beach, but I need to have my hand there, so I'll just wait a moment for that to dry. While the sea's still just drying off a little bit, I'm just adding a line here, which seems to be a windswept line between the beach and the grass, just with the tip of a brush and a little bit of weak brown. Sort of add some firmness. And then we've got a mixture of almost like golf course grass there and all sorts of other things, and some little rocks on the end. Just all adds to the definition of an island. Now, what I want to do now is lose the white, so I'm going to get a very big brush and just get some very weak French ultramarine on it and just try and lose the white paper so there's none showing, which would take the attention to the lighthouse. Didn't necessarily all cover the first time because this paper's got quite a tooth on it. And there's some rocks to put in yet, and a change in the water along here where the rocks go. But just doing a reasonable job of getting rid of most of the white. That's probably enough now, so that your eye is taken to the other areas. So now I can put the rocks in, which I'm going to use a number 2 brush and a mixture of cool brown, which in this case is raw umber, and the homemade grey, and just put them in. Just wet on wet, and they'll find their own line. And I'm going to do the same over here that I put the suggestion in, but I can see now that it needs to be a little bit bolder. I hope you've enjoyed this video and that you will get to the Isles of Scilly and enjoy painting the lovely islands. It's something very special.